Hello, I'm Patrick Daly and I'm one of the team at the Rural Doctors Association of Australia. Each year, RDAA and the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, or ACRRM, offer excellence awards that recognise some outstanding rural generalist doctors and some inspiring future doctors as well. Today's podcast features Dr. Gerard Quigley, the recipient of the prestigious ACRRM-RDAA Peter Graham Cohuna Award for 2022. Gerard is a quintessential rural generalist doctor who's served the small community of Cummins on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula for over 30 years, providing crucial local healthcare through both his general practice and the local hospital. He's also been a long-term supervisor of GP registrars and taught countless medical students in Cummins, helping to attract the next generation of doctors to a career in rural medicine. During the COVID lockdown in Cummins, Gerard and one of his daughters devised a unique plan to keep the local community connected, and it involved him stepping up in an unlikely way. I spoke with Gerard in the lead-up to the Rural Medicine Australia conference last October. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on across Australia as we listen to this podcast. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners who may be joining us. So Gerard, congratulations on receiving the ACRRM-RDAA Peter Graham Cohuna Award for 2022. What was your reaction when you were told the news?
I was actually at work. I was in between consults when I got a phone call. I didn't recognise the number, and often I wouldn't answer one of those calls, but I did answer this one. And I was surprised when it was Dr. Sarah Chalmers on the other end of the phone. My initial thought was I was going to be chastised for not attending any pesky panels in the last couple of years, but
Right.
Pleasantly surprised when she told me I'd won this award. It took quite a while for it to settle in. And as I was mentioning to you before, I'm still getting my head around it, particularly when I look at some previous recipients, and I was I was blown away to get the award, to be quite honest. I hung up the phone after talking to her briefly, and I was a little bit overwhelmed for a few minutes, actually, yeah.
And tell me a little bit about your childhood. Were you raised in a rural area?
No, I was born in Port Pirie. My father was a school teacher. He was a returned serviceman who did teaching after returning from the Second World War. And I was the youngest of 8 children. So although I was born in Port Pirie, we moved to Adelaide soon after that. Dad continued teaching in Adelaide. Very strong Catholic upbringing. Attended the local Catholic convent school in Hillcrest, and then from year 3 through to year 12, attended school at Christian Brothers College in the city in Wakefield Street in Adelaide. So a very Catholic, Irish Catholic upbringing. And yeah, there was a lot of kids, obviously, and being the youngest, it stood you well for learning how to actually stick up for yourself. But what I would say, my childhood was virtually in 2 parts. When I was about 10, one of my brothers was involved in a motor vehicle accident, had an acquired brain injury. And rather than put him into care, my parents decided to bring him home and care for him at home. So that was sort of a major disruptor in everybody's life in our family. And it was just added another complexity of difficulty about what childhood looked like. But having said that, I can look at it and say, we were well looked after, and rarely had new clothes, but hand-me-downs came pretty quick when you had 5 brothers. So
I can imagine.
Yeah, so that was my childhood, really. 10 years at Christian Brothers, and then on to Adelaide Uni.
So do you think what happened? Do you think what happened to your brother got you interested in becoming a doctor?
Yeah, but as I said before, I don't think so. I think what got me interested in being a doctor was about the science more than anything else, which is what interested me at school. Yeah. Mm.
So what was the first inkling you had that you might like to study medicine?
There was a couple of things about it. I mentioned before I was particularly interested in science, in chemistry and biology when I was at school. And I saw that as a good structured way to sort of keep going with that, looking at those aspects of science. I had a brother-in-law who was a rural GP in Yorktown. And so that was, I suppose, something that I became aware of as far as a career path, although I was a long way off a career path when he was there starting that. And I also had an older brother who did medicine about 7 years ahead of me, who's now a vascular surgeon in Townsville. So I suppose I had some influences around looking at medicine as a career.
Did you spend some time in Yorktown with your brother-in-law in that phase when you might have been deciding whether you'd become a rural doctor or even become a doctor?
Yeah, I did. I did part of my elective between 5th and 6th years with George Coker at Yorktown. Did about 3 or 4 weeks working with him there, which was interesting. Really enjoyed that. And when I was a resident medical officer, having finished training, occasionally if I had a few weeks off of leave, I'd go and work for him for a week to try and give him a week off. Also, as a medical student, spent a few weeks at Meningie down in Coorong as a medical school rotation. Enjoyed that as well. Yeah, but I don't think I was certain when I finished medical school that that's where I was going to end up. But it was certainly, I'd had some positive experiences and was able to draw on those, I suppose.
Now, just going back to before you started at medical school, and I saw you had a role, I'm guessing part-time or casual, at the Institute of Medical and Vet Science specimen reception, which sounded intriguing to me. What did that involve?
So there was about half a dozen medical and dental students who got a job working at the Institute of Medical and Veterinary Science. So from 5 p.m. till about 10:30 or 11, they still needed somebody on site to accept specimens as they were delivered, sort them, get them to the right lab. And also we were organising results to be sent out to the correct people. And those days it was mostly snail mail. So you were folding reports, putting them in envelopes and posting them off. But you're also taking the specimens at the front desk and cataloguing them, making sure that they're getting to the right lab, basically. And it was good money and it was easy work. It suited the students well because you could often get a bit of study done at the same time while you were there, and it provided you with a bit of beer money during the week, basically. Yeah.
So look, once you'd left medical school, you graduated as a young doctor. Where did your medical journey take you before you arrived in Cummins?
I applied for an internship at Modbury Hospital. And at that stage, Modbury Hospital was a very good place to go for GP training, basically. Gave you the opportunity to work in an emergency department that included a paediatric service. Had a paediatric service, so you get paediatric rotations in the same hospital, obstetrics, anaesthetics, and some subspecialties as well. So I started at Modbury and did my internship there. Did a couple of years as a resident medical officer, doing some more anaesthetics, emergency and obstetrics. And then went to Broken Hill for 12 months, doing some obstetrics in Broken Hill as well, before I eventually moved to Cummins.
How did you find your Broken Hill experience?
It was mixed. The work was really interesting. I had a great boss who was a Sri Lankan refugee named Mr. Ramalingam, and what he didn't know about operative obstetrics, I don't think anybody knew. Very kind, very supportive, and the work was full on. It was very, very busy. I had 2 young children at that time while I was there. My youngest daughter, I don't think actually knew who I was till we left Broken Hill, because quite often I wouldn't be home from work before 7 or 8, and was often getting called out at night. So it was great work, but socially it was diabolical, to be quite honest.
So you've practiced as a solo doctor in large part in Cummins in rural South Australia now for more than 30 years. What attracted you there initially and what has kept you there?
Part of the attraction to Cummins was I had been to Cummins as an adolescent. We'd come over here. We knew some people over here. And I knew the town was friendly and it was nice enough town to be living in. The issue at Broken Hill had got to the point where Joanne, my wife, said she was happy to stay working in a country town, but not Broken Hill.
Yes, right.
And at that time, the local ABC News, Broken Hill shares the news with South Australia. There was an article on the ABC News pointing out that there was a crisis with medical workforce on the Eyre Peninsula. There was no doctor in Cummins, no doctor at Woodner. I don't think Elliston had a doctor at the time. And I basically said, well, Cummins is a nice town. Why don't we have a look at that? So we decided we'll move to Cummins on the basis of them not having a doctor and looking for one, really.
After the extensive overtime you'd had at Broken Hill and the responsibilities there, did the thought of filling a gap in Cummins and being the solo doctor there, did you find that a bit overwhelming, or how did you get past that initial fear that it might be more overwhelming than Broken Hill?
I had a bit of a discussion. There was one of the GPs working for the Flying Doctor Service in Broken Hill while I was there. It was an ex-GP from Woodner, and he was very supportive. Often he'd come into the hospital if I was on call. We'd have a cup of tea, and he'd discuss how you can safely set up service in a small town like that. And I think it's really a matter of knowing what your limitations are and where your supports are. At that time, although the town was solo, there was good supports amongst the surrounding practices. So there was a very good general surgeon and very much general surgeon in Port Lincoln, as well as a general physician who's still there and does a marvellous job. There was also, within the general practices, there was people who could support and provide an anaesthetic service if you needed it, an assistant, all those things. So if, for example, you were facing an obstetric emergency or you were facing an issue with requiring somebody to need an anaesthetic for surgery, there was a lot of goodwill and support amongst practices neighbouring. Yeah.
And how far away was the nearest base hospital then? And I guess, has it changed much since?
Yeah, having come from Broken Hill, which was under-resourced, but it was a base hospital. There really wasn't a base hospital on the Eyre Peninsula. The services in Port Lincoln, for example, when I arrived in Cummins, consisted of about 8 GPs. Most of them either GP anaesthetist or GP obstetricians, and then there was a general surgeon, general physician. So there was certainly nothing that looked like a base hospital locally.
So what did your work mix look like when you first arrived in Cummins and in your first years there, and how has that changed over the years?
So I'd say when I arrived in Cummins, like, what I was interested in was the obstetric side of things and anaesthetics. Minor surgery was the sorts of things I was interested in doing. But I also knew that it was important that you ran the emergency department and also ran a general practice part to it. Over time, mainly to do with decisions made at a state government level, we eventually lost the obstetric service and then closed the anaesthetic service. So the work that I currently do is probably more around, certainly still doing emergency medicine, secondary care for inpatients at the hospital. But the vast majority of work I'm doing is around the general practice side of it and enhanced primary care and chronic disease management. Yeah.
Has the chronic disease management side of things grown over your years there? Has it become more of a focus?
Yeah, I would say that probably the biggest thing that made a difference to us is we got involved in program called the Improvement Foundation. And one of the people running that was Tony Lemke, who was brilliant at it. And as part of the Australian Primary Care Collaboratives, we did a lot of work on how we measure our outcomes and how we measure what our population problems are looking like, and identifying those patients within our population that needed extra care. So there was certainly a very robust framework that we set up that was around improving enhanced primary care and chronic disease management, which has reduced the number of people that need to present to the ED or be admitted for secondary care.
What were the main findings from that survey in terms of what part of the population needed more care to ensure that preventable medicine was being implemented and keeping them away from the ED?
I think it was about looking at patients that we were mainly looking at were diabetes, patients with ischemic heart disease, and patients with cardiac failure, as well as chronic obstructive airways disease. But having clear measurements about what we thought were the appropriate targets to reach, and then becoming a little bit pedantic about making sure people hit their targets. Also giving people a clear understanding of what they could do to try and improve their outcomes and reach their targets. And also give them a clear indication of when they should be presenting to us.
And how big was the impact on the reduction in ED presentations after that program commenced and as it continued?
The Improvement Foundation would tell us that we should measure all of these things, but I'll put my hand up and say we didn't specifically measure it. But anecdotally, there's been a reduction in admissions and presentations after hours.
So how much commitment has it taken on your part to keep medical services open at the local hospital over the years?
It's been an ongoing struggle. The difficulty is that the decisions about reduction of services in the small hospitals on the Eyre Peninsula has been made surreptitiously and been enacted through artful inactivity. So you can't actually pin somebody and say, this was your decision. But if you're starved of funds and can't get appropriate staff to provide a service, then it's got to close. So the classic example of that would be the obstetric service, where I had to make a decision to close the obstetric service because I no longer felt it was safe. And then the South Australian government can say, well, that was a local decision. It was a local decision that was made because we didn't have the appropriate resources to do the job safely.
How hard was it for you to make that decision personally as the local doctor there?
It was very difficult. And having said that, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't go back to practicing obstetrics now. But it was difficult, and it was also difficult because it was out of our hands, really. We'd made a number of suggestions about how we could safely go on. But it wasn't appropriately, it wasn't funded appropriately or given the right support to make it happen.
I understand a second doctor has recently joined you at your practice, and you've had registrars who've worked with you from time to time over the years.
Yeah.
How much of a difference has that made for you? And also, what have been your strategies for coping with the heavy workload and the after hours demands of working as a solo doctor?
I think as far as heavy workload, it's important to schedule time off. So it's important to plan ahead and make sure you're getting access to appropriate locum support so that you can get time away from the practice, try and recharge the batteries. The other thing is I'm extremely lucky with the nursing staff support I have at the local hospital. And I was having a discussion just recently with the executive medical director of the region and said, look, you probably don't understand the skill set of these people that work in small hospitals that have got very, very limited resources. And you notice it when you try and bring in agency staff. And quite often the agency staff don't actually understand how to work in that environment. So I'm blessed with very, very good nursing staff. They're very supportive. almost protective at times. And that's an important part of actually managing that workload.
And what about having a second doctor at the practice now? Has that eased the pressure considerably for you?
It has. Dr. Schroeder Prang came to us from Cape Town. We were very fortunate to get her to come and work with us. And she's just started on the independent pathway towards fellowship with ACRRM, which is great. And she's taking a great deal of the load of the consulting work already. So that's good. The issue is around supervision, and APRA's not being particularly, they're pretty opaque about how we move forward with getting to supervision, because they are still insisting that the level of supervision that Dr. Schroeder Prang receives from me, I think it's far more than she really needs. Yeah.
What's the way forward there, do you think?
I don't know, is the short answer. And other people I've spoken to about their interactions with APRA on this have said the same thing, that it's an opaque process and nobody can really get their head around what the stepping stones are. Yeah.
Looking at the next generation of doctors, you've had significant involvement in training 5th and 6th year medical students from Adelaide during your career and your time at Cummins. And in fact, as I understand it, you've won some awards due to your clinical teaching there. What have you found to be the secret to a great rural clinical experience for medical students and junior doctors?
I think it's about having the confidence that allowing them to practice, basically. So we do a lot of parallel consulting where they see the patients on their own and then see the patient with you, giving them the opportunity to actually explore a history examination, formulate a plan on their own. And I suppose we're doing less procedural stuff than we have previously, but also giving them the opportunity to participate in some procedural work, in a safe way.
Are you encouraged by the enthusiasm of the next generation of doctors for rural medicine and rural generalism? Do you think that's grown over the past 10 years?
I am encouraged. I mean, they're always, well, almost always enthusiastic, happy to be here, engaged with staff, patients. Whether that's, I don't know that it's actually grown. We're pleased to have 5th years coming through on rotation, on a rural rotation out of Whyalla. And that seems to be working quite well for the students and for us. And we try and make it a positive experience. And I think most of them, feedback is that they feel that they get a better understanding of what rural practice looks like. And one of my concerns about it is that on the Eyre Peninsula itself, there's a number of towns now that don't have any access to medical care at all. So Woodner, Kimber have lost their doctors. And if we're not training students about working in these small towns, how you can do it safely, then it's very unlikely that we're going to get them later in their training to consider that that might be a reasonable option. And I don't think it's right we continue to mine international medical graduates from countries that probably need them more than us, but that's what we've been doing.
Do you think it's more a state, or do you think states need to lift up to the responsibility of trying to ensure medical students and junior doctors have a better training exposure or a better ability to be able to gain exposure to rural practice rather than just a federal level issue?
Yeah.
Is there a disconnect there that's making it an impossible solution, do you think?
There's always been a disconnect, and there's always been finger pointing to say that whether it's a federal or a state problem. And I do think the state government could do more about trying to get people into these smaller towns. They still seem focused on regional centres like Whyalla, Port Lincoln, Port Augusta and the like. That's not going to resolve Woodner or Kimber's problem.
What do you think needs to be done to encourage more junior doctors and medical students to go to the bush?
I think it would be handy if they could be seen that that was a valued thing to do. There's a lot of talk about how services provided by rural and remote doctors is valued, but there's been a Medicare rebate, and the rebate for working in Cummins looks very similar to the rebate working in the green leafy suburbs of Adelaide. I think they probably need to actually show that they do value people working in these situations.
So what have you got out of teaching medical students personally over the years?
That this is not an original quote, but it's quite true, that patients do actually think I'm a nicer doctor when there's a medical student around.
Right.
Right, and I think that's probably true. But there's no doubt that they refocus you. They'll ask you questions that make you think, I really do have to think about why I did that. Yeah, so it does have that benefit, yeah.
So over the years working as a rural doctor, what surprised you most about life as a rural doctor?
I was surprised at how much the community respects and values the service. It doesn't surprise me now, but when I first arrived here, I was really quite surprised at how much they valued what I was doing. So, and that's nice, and it's ongoing. Like, you're still respected and valued within the community. There's no doubt about it.
And what about the most challenging times of your career? Are there times in your career that have been really hard going for you, or even challenges that have been challenges in a positive way?
So I think the biggest challenge in a town this size is the longer you're here, the closer you get to members of the community. So you can get some health outcomes that are just devastating, terrible for those involved, and some of that hits you personally as well. So just having a way to actually deal with those things, yeah.
How do you deal with those things?
Yeah, well, I've got a very supportive family, wife, so I often talk things through with my wife, Joanne. I'm trying to make sure I do some positive things around health, walking and the like. Again, taking time off. Yeah.
Is there a need, do you think, for more support for rural doctors for those sort of times when challenges are pretty evident in rural practice?
Yeah, I think there is, and they're certainly out there, like the Doctor Doc program and the like. It's a matter of whether people feel they want to approach that. But I think the supports are there if people want to seek them out.
And what about the most rewarding parts of your career? What have really stood out to you in your time there as being the rewarding moments?
I think every now and then I'll get a letter. Most recently, I had a letter from a respiratory physician who had been a medical student in Cummins. And at the bottom of the letter, he'd written, you may not remember me, but he said, on my last day in Cummins, I came to a barbecue at your house and you told me, here's the steak, if you stuff it up, you fail. Now, so he obviously has a fond recollection of working in the town. So I think knowing that you've maybe had a positive impact on some people through their training is a positive thing. The other thing I would say is I feel that we've built a robust health service here, like a proper primary healthcare team that produces good results for the community. And I hope that will be left as a legacy, basically, as far as systems put in place that will allow ongoing care of the community.
Is there any particular story or event in your community that stands out to you from your time as a doctor in Cummins?
Probably the event would be the Wangari bushfires that occurred some time ago. I thought the interesting thing about that, I mean, it was extremely challenging. It was truly a disaster. The hospital was cut off by fire, and we were trying to retrieve out a number of people with facial and airway burns. But the thing about it was we had a disaster plan and it actually worked, which was interesting. that all occurred because of work that was done previously through the Division of General Practice. So, yeah, the event was devastating. People lost their lives and people lost their livelihoods, and a lot of people were threatened, including the hospital. So, yeah, that would stick in my mind still. Yeah.
Do you think that was a sign of things to come in terms of climate in your area and potential future crises that you, as a healthcare team, need to be prepared for in the future?
Yeah, I certainly believe we need to be addressing climate, and that it's going to impact on the point of view of floods and fire and health. There's no doubt about it.
Are there any areas of medicine now that you're interested in, particularly that you didn't think as a junior doctor or a medical student you would be interested in?
Yeah, I suppose when I was doing my training as a RMO, I was interested in obstetrics and anaesthetics, procedural type positions. And when I first arrived in Cummins, that's what I was interested in doing. So I reopened the obstetric service, reopened the operating theatre, and sort of got things cranked up. And I thought that, well, I always thought, well, general practice, you have to do that, but it's not really what I'm interested in doing. But now I can see that that's where the payoff is for the patients. It's primary healthcare that actually saves the lives. It's interesting. I've got people in the town that will come to you and say, "Oh, you saved my life on this because of what you did on this particular day." That's nice, but there's probably another 10 people for any one of those who have had their life saved by something as simple as sorting out their cholesterol or managing their uncontrolled hypertension or getting them to quit smoking. So I think that's where we're going to make the biggest impact on health. It's not sexy, but it's where you get the results.
At what point after arriving in Cummins, how many years after arriving in Cummins did that hit you that general practice was where you could make the most impact, if you like, in terms of long-term health?
Yeah, I think it was gradual, but I would say that the work that I did through the Improvement Foundation and the advice and leadership that Tony Lemke gave in that situation, probably what turned it around really. Particularly, knowing that you could use the computer system, which we'd all just thought we'd just write scripts with. There was all this data in there that none of us was looking at, and then suddenly you had this trove of data that was going to improve the health outcomes of your community. It's a bit of an eye-opener.
And I see in your practice itself, you've also taken steps to survey patients to find out areas that you can actually improve the patient experience at, which impressed me, given that I think you're probably the only practice in town, but to go to that next level shows a real commitment to patients. What was the driver for that, and what did you find?
The advice we were getting from them was good advice, but it was very difficult for us to put in place. They suggested things like maybe we should have another doctor, so there was more choice of practitioners, which is a great idea. But I wish I knew how to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's all part of just trying to improve outcomes for people. And if people can see there's a barrier to their attending, then we want to hear about it so that we can remove the barrier.
That commitment to the community also showed through during the COVID pandemic. As I understand it, you set up an online district talent show with one of your daughters. What was that about, and why was it so important?
So Sophie, one of my daughters, who was working as an event manager in Sydney, doing things like Splendour in the Grass and Falls. But when COVID occurred, obviously that position became redundant. So she brought herself back to Cummins, and I knew what happened with idle hands, so I thought I needed to give her a job. So I suggested talent show. Now, the reason it was suggested was in times of adversity in the past, when the community needed to get together or needed fundraising or whatever, they would often run a talent show or a musical, or those sorts of things, raise money for the community. So that was out of the question while everybody's locked down in their houses. So we came up with the idea of running online talent show. And there surprisingly, there are a number of very talented people to put up acts. Unfortunately, I was not one of them. My act was very, very poor, and I got told on a number of occasions. Yes,
but you had to set an example.
I did. Mine had to be the first act up, so that people knew that the bar was very, very low.
Right. You had to make everyone feel comfortable.
Yes.
How important was that in connecting people during the COVID pandemic in your community, as you say, with lockdowns, keeping everyone in houses and away from others?
It was important, and I've got to say that I don't do social media, so I needed to get advice from staff about how we get messages out, because the messages we were trying to get out were changing daily. So the only way to really do that effectively was through social media. So the idea of running the talent show was to sort of get people on board, and then open up that channel through, I think it was Facebook, but I'm completely naive with regard to social media.
Now, in terms of your kids, how many have remained in Cummins? How many have stayed in a rural community, and have any gone into the health sector?
Yeah, so my oldest son still lives in Cummins, so he's a builder in Cummins, and we're very lucky to have he and his partner here, because we're grandparents now, which completely changed one's perspective on life. The other kids are in Adelaide, so teacher Sophie's back doing event management. Hannah, one of my daughters, is working for the other college, working on bringing registrars into the program. Matthew is working as property developer, and Alice, my youngest daughter, is doing medicine at Flins Uni. So, yeah.
I'd have to say, very handy having a builder in town.
Yes.
And
yes.
hopefully available to you.
Yes. Yes.
You mentioned as a grandparent, it changes your perspective on things. In what way has it done that?
I think grandchildren are just marvellous. I mean, you can get them as wound up as you like and then send them home. And it sort of makes parenthood make sense. Like, you know, those sleepless nights with wondering why these children won't sleep or whatever. You just get all the fun bits and you don't have to worry about any of the stress. Yeah.
Now, you've had a long involvement with ACRRM as well,
yes.
and a variety of roles. Just tell me a little bit about what involvement you have had with the college.
Probably not as much as I should, but I'm a training supervisor with ACRRM, and I've had a few ACRRM registrars come through the practice. And I have been a pesky panellist as well, but I've fallen by the wayside there. It's been a little bit difficult when I've been solo to try and actually juggle that and get it done.
As a registrar supervisor, how have you found that experience as opposed to training medical students? And have you been impressed by the quality of registrars who have come through?
The last registrar I had, he was an ACRRM registrar, Russell Sankey, and he was brilliant. He was here when the pandemic started, and he just took it on. So he was instrumental in us setting up a fever clinic or a respiratory clinic at the town hall. We had that up and running in no time. So he was very good, and also very, very happy to take on a teaching role with medical students as well. We've always previously we'd been involved with Adelaide to Outback as a training program, and they invested a lot of time in vertical integration of training. So having a training program within the practice that includes a GP consultant as well as a registrar and medical students. So we just kept going with that basically, and it worked very well.
So apart from grandchildren and hopefully planning extensions to your house using a discounted local builder, what other interests do you have outside medicine?
I'd say my major interest is my family, and I'm still very lucky that my kids have put up with me for all these years, and all the things I didn't quite get to that I should have, and they've forgiven all that. They're still quite involved in our life, so I'm thankful for that. So family is very important. I still enjoy doing a lot of reading, walking, and been on some very good walking holidays across England, Camino in Spain, Three Capes in Tasmania. So it sort of gives us a bit of a focus about what's coming up, something positive coming up. And the interesting thing I find about walking is you can actually clear your head. And it seems to be a form of meditation. You can be walking and think about nothing, which sometimes is a helpful thing to do, I think. And I don't do enough of it, but fishing. So when I can get around to it, do some fishing, yeah.
What's been the most spectacular walk you've done overseas? And does it compare to local walks?
It would be Wainwright's walk from coast to coast across England. So you go through the Lakes District and cross the Yorkshire Moors, and yeah, that was very, very good. Yeah, and some spectacular scenery. If you could remember to look up and look at the scenery rather than look down at your boots so you didn't fall over. But yeah.
And you'd be channeling all creatures great and small as you were walking through some of those areas, I'd imagine.
Yes, that's right.
Well, Gerard, thanks very much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and congratulations once again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And that was Dr. Gerard Quigley, the recipient of the ACRRM-RDAA Peter Graham Cohuna Award for 2022. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to having you tune in again. Until next time, happy days.